Hey everyone and welcome. So in the last video we created a 3-node SvKMS cluster. The first one, we deployed those OVAs. Following on from that, we initialized, licensed and added them into that 2n+1, that 3-node cluster, as we can see here, connecting to them on 8443. What we're now going to do is to connect and log in on our standard interface and configure this with VMware-based encryption. Utilize this KMS to encrypt VMware virtual machines. Now, the concept with this is you are creating, or we are creating, a trust relationship between the KMS and whatever device is then driving the encryption. Now, the principle is to separate the lock and the key. So typically, for example, these would live, not necessarily on the same cluster. You would want to separate them somewhere else, be it a separate box, a separate piece of hardware in a locked room, or perhaps in the cloud or up in your main data center, for example. Referencing one of our use cases, we have a 300-site pharmacy chain that uses SvKMS to encrypt 300 pharmacies in remote locations with vCenter and SvKMS up in their main data center. But they also leverage that same SvKMS cluster to encrypt some of their production data center workloads, living within their VMware environment, their external facing website, things like that, whatever it might be. Okay, so that's one of the great things about SvKMS is it's then able to be used for different applications, different encryption workflows, different encryption use cases. So what we're going to do first and foremost then is to just create a group in order to be able to put our vSphere keys within. This is just a logical sort of bucket, as it were, to put them in. And we'll then create a vCenter user account. So MC-VCSA as the name of my vCenter. This is a key access user. We'll throw in my email address. And we can see that we can then give some default groups for those keys to go in. And then, as I referenced with that trust relationship, rather than the two devices authenticating via credentials, they're going to then use a certificate. So this is then generating that. You can, of course, then use different certificate authorities and all of that kind of thing in order to be able to manage and utilize the certificates. So we're going to add this vCenter user account within SvKMS and download the certificate. So here we can see the PEM file, and what we then do is effectively utilize that certificate. We import it into vCenter so that those two devices can chat, and vCenter can request keys from the KMS, and the KMS can then come along and rescind keys or rekey or various other operations that we might want to do. So if I select my vCenter, I come up to the Configure tab, and let me just minimize that down just to get a little bit more screen space. We can then come to Key Management Servers. Now this, I think, does get renamed in different versions of VMware, so just bear that in mind. It still lives in the same place, but it might be slightly different terminology. What we're going to do is to add in our KMS cluster. So here we'll call it Mark SvKMS, just to be imaginative. SvKMS. And I'm then going to give it that IP address and our default KMIP port number. You can see with a quick Google that defaults then to 5696. That's a standard communication, much like email is on 25, for example. We can fill in some proxy details, but we don't need to worry about that. For now, we're just going to come along and add in that cluster to the vCenter. So this is going to think for a second to start chatting, and what we then need to be able to do is to add in that certificate to be able to establish that trust. Okay, so let's do this, remove this, yes please. So what we'll do is just try that one more time. Mark-SvKMS1 local 10.6.0 .97 5696. So we can see up on the screen here, it's established that communication and started chatting with that certificate. However, what we need to do, as this thinks a little bit, we can see the certificate status. We can then establish trust. Now, when configuring these two to be able to talk to each other, what we're going to do is enable SvKMS to trust the vCenter. And in order to be able to do that, we're going to be using a certificate and private key. So if we select next, what we can then do is upload a file and browse to that exported out, downloaded PEM file that we then do for both of these options here and establish the trust. So with that then trust established, as we can see on here, we can see when that certificate is valid for. So obviously do just bear that in mind, the default generating for 1 year. Obviously if that trust relationship then expires without that certificate being extended or renewed or whatever, you know, that they're no longer going to be able to chat, you could be impacting things. So we can now come along and just confirm that we have our host encryption mode enabled within VMware. And we can come along and create a new virtual machine. Just looking here, if I come back to my dashboard, there we go, we can see different things going on here. And if we create a new virtual machine, we select to encrypt the virtual machine, put it on whatever storage we're utilizing, not necessarily SvSAN, any storage with a VMware-based encryption. And you can also view encryption policies. Now I'm just using the default, and we can just create a base VM, as it were. I don't know how much space I have, so we better thin provision this one. And we can see there various different bits and pieces. Okay. So that's now created. What we'll notice is that it doesn't actively change the number of keys within SvKMS until that VM is actually powered on. That's when it will be really requesting the keys to do its work. You know, encrypting the different VM objects, the VMDK, the NVRAM that actually make up that virtual machine. And with that, if we then refresh one more time, we can then see our keys provisioned, you know, not just added, but actually in use and provisioned out there. Now, again, just to kind of go over the flow of some of these things, what we've done is deployed our SvKMS cluster. We have our VMware vCenter. We've created that trust relationship between those two devices. We've created a virtual machine, and when that guy is then up and running, those keys requested, provisioned, and in use to be able to encrypt that virtual machine. Now, keys can obviously then be managed from within SvKMS, and that includes then being able to carry out various operations against those guys, from deactivating them as compromised or rekeying or other various different bits and pieces. Rotate keys, add keys, change the signing, everything else. Now, the thing to bear in mind is that obviously VMware also caches those keys. So if you just straight delete a key here without rescinding it, well, the host still has then a copy of that key in memory, because it might be in a situation, and should be when the two are separated, that you could have connectivity issues between the key management server and the encrypted application or workflow. So it holds that key in memory, in volatile memory, in cache, so that should connectivity drop between the two, obviously it's not disrupted. But obviously if we were to delete the key this side and then restart that virtual machine, it would then make that request to re-get. Unable to get the key, it would be unable to power on, or if it was rescinded, or so on and so forth. So it's all just about thinking about that flow, for these applications, these encryption workflows. So SvKMS and VMware-based encryption. Thank you very much for viewing. I hope you found this informative. And in the next video, we will configure SvKMS with SvSAN encryption.